How's everybody doing today? Oh, don't you love it? Everybody from the East Coast, the coffee hasn't kicked in yet. It's okay, we'll fix this. So like Carl said, my name is Steve Gates. My official title is Head Design Evangelist at Envision. I know that always sounds dangerously like something out of HBO's documentary Silicon Valley. But what it basically, thank you, one person got it, we're working on that. So what that basically means is I get to travel around the world working with a lot of really good companies, a lot of companies that are really struggling to break through, to try to figure out how to elevate the impact of design. And along with that, for the past 3+ years or so, I've been doing this sort of a passion project that I've done. It's a podcast called The Crazy One that honestly deals with a lot of the topics that we want to deal with today. So what I want to do is just sort of give you a really quick primer, right? So at Envision, we basically look at the world through 3 lenses. Through people, which is basically your company and your culture, your practices, which are things like your processes and your methodologies, and platforms, which is your tools. Obviously, we have a rather strong opinion about one of those. But for today, since we're talking about leadership, we're just going to focus on those top 2. Because I think, it's a really, really interesting time. And, I think, one of the things that I love about a lot of Carl's events is that it's a lot of people who show up and be really honest. So I think that's where I want to start, and that's going to be my ask, because I always take sort of this opening slot really seriously. And one of the things I want to do is to ask all of us, and again, much like hipster, that's not a typo, I want to really kind of have us all be honest with a capital H for the next 2 days. It's funny whenever I go around and you'll talk about, like, companies like, we want design with a capital D. Like, the hell does that mean? But so for this case, this is like honesty with a capital H. Because the thing that I've seen for so many of us is moments like this are so rare. What we do is so rare. It is so different. There are so few people who understand what it is that we do. And I'm always surprised that at a lot of these events, how many of us show up with like a mask on. Because we walk around and everybody says, how are you doing? What's going on? It's like, it's great. My company is fantastic. My team is amazing. They are all tall and good looking. We are all smart. Everything ships on time. And you are fucking lying about all of that. So I think my thing, and that's my ask here, right, is like, let's start with actually being honest with each other. Because I think there are so many other places in this world where you can get empathy from people, you can get support from people, but this is such an important place to be able to do this that I just wanted to start with that. But I want to press on that probably just a touch more and kind of talk about a few different truths that I'm seeing. Because the interesting thing that I've seen over the last 1.5 years in this role is I've traveled the world, I've worked with so many different leaders, so many different companies, but it's amazing no matter where you go in the world how much stays the same. And I think the first truth that we see around a lot of this is that as design leaders, we are having a moment, right? Like, we are having an impact. All of a sudden, like, I was in the back of a cab in New York City the other day, and there was like some little conference on like that little mini annoying TV screen, and design thinking was one of the things that came up. It's like, we've gone too far. Like, if it's in the back of a cab, like, that's just not going to work. But I think that a lot of this is that, how do we break through organizationally? And this was really why I took this role. It's why I left. I'm no longer a head of design. I'm no longer like, doing a day-to-day designer, because I saw that as an industry we're having this moment. And you'll see there are these sort of like really nice sort of glossy books that are on all your chairs here. And this new design frontier report was something that Leah Bewley did. And she basically asked me one question and was nice enough to put my name in it as well. But what this really did was to look at what is the current state of design and design impact in the world today. I know that a lot of other consultancies and other things have done things like this. This is about 77 times bigger than what anybody's done before. And we see some interesting things. Like, the good news is design is driving results, right? Like, 3/4 of companies actually say the quality of their product and design has gotten better. Great. We see other really interesting things. Like, design maturity does not equate to your team size. Actually, there's a really interesting thing here, because what you'll see is in the 5 different levels, 1 being make it pretty, 5 we have a really big business impact, a lot of teams get stuck at 3. And the interesting part is whenever you look at this graph, what most companies do is what most companies do. Whenever you get stuck, throw people at the problem. But that doesn't actually mean that you're going to break through or be able to do things like that. But you can see some of the highest maturity teams only have 13 to 15 people. I'm still not quite sure how we get to 1/3 of a person, but depending on the company you're at, I'm sure we can optimize for it. But I think that the other thing is that, look, and this is the slide that everybody always loves to steal. right? Because the one thing that I find amazing is that companies that are often lower design maturity have executives who constantly ask, how do we quantify the business impact of design? You know what the funny thing is on high maturity teams? They don't ask that. But here's the reason why, is because they understand that as we look at in the pink high maturity companies versus low maturity companies, on average, companies that have high design maturity have about 4x revenue. Their cost savings, which means how can they actually be efficient in getting things to market, is about 5 times better. Their time to market, so actually how long does it take to do something, because there isn't all that political BS, which we'll get into more later, is about 6 times better. And then the one that everybody loves is that the valuation for that company is about 26 times higher than companies with low design maturity. So isn't it amazing how when all of a sudden people want this but then really don't want to invest in it, why if this is the return, suddenly they take it a lot more seriously. And I think that's why that document has been so great, is because it's been so empowering for so many design leaders to go to their executives and say, look, this is why it matters. But I think the other thing that you see with this is that design is absolutely having a moment, right? Like as we go, there's so much talk about, you know, all these different methodologies, all these different things. There are chief design officers, like there's all this sort of stuff. But as you look at, and we went through this study, there are 5 different levels of maturity. And as you sort of go through and map those out, what you're going to see is that right now, 83% of the world's global companies are stuck in the middle to the bottom of design maturity. So the good news is, if you were looking at those levels and going, wow, I really feel like we aren't getting it right, wow, I'm really struggling, wow, I really feel like as a leader I'm alone, I don't know what I'm doing, congratulations, 83% of the world is there with you, we just don't talk about it. But this is the problem, right? And this is my concern, is that if we as leaders cannot find ways to break through organizationally, design will have a moment. Because budgets will go other places. It'll be that time when it's like, oh yeah, we tried design thinking, or we tried design sprints, or oh, we bought a whole lot of Post-it notes. Literally, I had a company that I met with the other day who told me they did design thinking, and I asked them to show me their methodology, and they said, we have Post-it notes. Still trying to recover from that moment. But that's the thing, right, is that this is the challenge, is because what happens as you get to higher levels of maturity means that you have to affect the company, not just your team. Because in levels 1 through 3, it's basically about how do you get your ship together? How do you get your team together? How do you do those sort of things to be able to really make an impact? But the problem is that higher maturity means now the business. So your partners in product, in engineering, your executives, everybody else now need to go along for the ride, which is often where it gets extremely difficult. And so again, if you have the report here, but if you really want to do that, if you haven't checked out designbetter.com, I think this is an incredible site. Aaron Walter has put this together with Eli Woolery, a bunch of other people. Amazing books, a lot of great articles, really good thing to be able to check out. The end of my sales pitch. The other thing that I found, super interesting, a lot of people don't realize this, that your work tells the truth about your company. Because whenever I go into work with a company, I can tell you before I show up, before I ask a single question, how healthy and how well your design team runs just by looking at your work. Most of us, if we pay attention, can do this. Super simple thing that I'll do is I'll ask the company for an org chart. And isn't it amazing whenever that org chart suddenly matches the navigation of their website or their app? I can tell you before I even show up that you are siloed, you are political, you are making a lot of internal fights, because you are, and this is where that term comes from, shipping the org, right? And that's the real issue, because I think that that's that sort of thing here, is that whenever, and this is what it comes down to for me, whenever internal politics are more important than your consumers, this is why so many companies struggle. Because if it's about if product is right, or if design is right, or if engineering is right, or what we're doing is we're waging these internal wars and nobody was talking to our customer, that's where we really struggle. Because isn't it crazy in this time that we have to remind our companies that oh yeah, there are people who consume our stuff? That's crazy to me. I think that's why you see this revival in design thinking and all these other things. But the other thing that I see at so many companies is whenever they say, okay, look, how do we start to change this? They're like, well, let's invest in a bunch of process, let's invest in work, let's do some more TPS reports, let's do something where we're going to invest in all that, and if we do that, then our culture and everything else is going to get better. That is 100% wrong in my opinion, right? The work is the truth. If a work is a product of the way your teams work and think, then this is the way it actually should be. If you invest in the way you work, the way you think, the work will follow. Because like I said, it is a byproduct of the way that your team operates. It's a byproduct of how people show up every day. And that's the thing, is that right now, so Harvard Business Review recently did a report that about 80% of people will say they just simply show up to work. They don't feel empowered. They don't feel like they're actually having a contribution. And if you do that, then that's a big part of the problem. But the real issue that we're dealing with here as leaders is this, right? No matter who you are, you show up to work every day, you try to have ideas. Having better ideas and doing better designs is not our problem. Our problem is how do we deal with all of the bullshit that surrounds it, right? It's okay. Most of these talks are like part intervention and part therapy. It's okay. We'll have a moment here. It'll be okay. We'll build up to it. It's still early. Coffee's kicking in. But that's the thing, right? It's how do I deal with the politics and the strategy, and how do I deal with all these other people and budgets and inner fighting and all this other stuff that has nothing to do with what I love. I did not get into this industry to deal with any of this stuff. But that's what's happened, right? Is that for most of us, and most people I think haven't necessarily realized that, is we've moved from visual design to product design. Visual design was about pixel perfect comps, making it look pretty, doing a lot of those sort of things. Product design is about working with a whole lot more teams, figuring out how do I deal with data, how do I deal with executives, how do I deal with a lot of other things that now are suddenly coming into play. And that's a huge issue. But a lot of it for me, whenever I go in and it looks at how do we actually start to affect and change things, there are usually two things that are at play. There's behavior and there's thinking. Now, for most companies, whenever I see them and they say, hey, we want to go make a change, we want to do something differently, we want to be more creative inside, outside the box, realign the paradigm, whatever friggin' buzzword you want to use, they actually will try to just triage behavior, right? Like, we're going to use some new words, we're going to get some new values. It's like bonus points if the first letter of those values adds up to a word that somehow means something about, to our company. Like, they're those sort of things, right? But the problem is behavior is just the expression. And if you're only dealing with the behavior, what you're going to see is, yeah, people will use some new words, they'll do a few things a little bit differently, but in a few weeks, a few months, the problem's going to come back up. It's just going to come back up in a different way. So for a lot of the work that I want to do, and what I want to talk about today, is to actually talk about the real problem, which is how do you get to the way people think? Because that's the real issue. Because if you leave the way that people think untriaged, if you leave that alone, you're going to keep having the same problem over and over and over again. But the problem is, working with thinking is a lot harder. But here's the other thing I'm going to say, and this is something that I have never seen anybody say on stage, which is why I do it so very, very much. Every single company in the world is dysfunctional. Whoever you think is like killing it and doing it great and getting all the best people, and they're the ones like, trust me, I probably work with them, and congratulations, they are just as screwed up as you are. So this idea that like somebody has got it right, that somehow that us having problems is a problem is BS. Right? Every company is dysfunctional. What you find is that the good ones are able to acknowledge and deal with those problems. There's a level of transparency. They're able to put these things out in the open to be able to say, hey, you're right, this is a problem. This is what we're going to do about it. We're going to discuss it. We understand that we're going through this. The bad ones, the ones that struggle, are like, everything's fine, nothing to see here. Keep moving, we're all good. You need to make the team believe what we're doing, right? Like, you've all heard those sort of things where it's wrong, it's a lie, you don't really believe it, but you know what, we're just going to kind of cover it over and pretend like everything's fine until hopefully it goes away, because that always works. But that's the thing, right, is that whenever I go through this, I think, honestly, most companies are more afraid of changing their processes than actually being disrupted. Like, it's amazing to me how many things, comfort is the enemy of greatness. Because for so many people, they will continue to do whatever it is that they are comfortable with time and time and time again, just because they've always done it. Even if it's wrong, even if it's the way it always is, just because it's what they've always done. Now, there's somebody who I became friends with a few years ago who I think came up with this line that sort of distills it down perfectly. He wrote this book called This Might Get Me Fired. But we're really at a place where right now the innovation I think most companies need or want, to have it actually happen, it will need to happen in a way that will probably not be authorized. Because most companies are unable to get out of their own way to be able to let it happen. Because here's the other reality, is that innovation and hierarchy rarely coexist well together. And so this ability to say, like, oh, we're going to have a process to be innovative. What? Like, being innovative means we need to fail. Yeah, people really love that. It also means whenever we start, we probably aren't going to know where we end up whenever we're done with this. This uncertainty is what drives people crazy, but that's our superpower. But here's sort of the thing I want to talk about today, right? Is redefining the word innovation. Because this is the most abused, overused, like people use this word like they know what the hell it means. But my thing is, like, I would argue for us, what we need to do is we need to start investing in cultural and emotional innovation the same way we invest in product innovation. Because for most companies, 90% of them spend their time on how do we make the product better. We spend almost no time thinking about us as leaders. We spend no time thinking about our team, about retention. Like, this is why, for most creatives, the joke is true if people move every 2 years. It's getting worse because as you look at digital nomads and the gig economy, some people are just abandoning that altogether. Entire new models are emerging where people are just willing to float around and just go from different job to different job. But this is the sort of thing that we need to think about if we want to break through. So there are 4 things that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what are some of like the traditional traps that are out there that I think impede a lot of this stuff. Talk about pink elephants, because I think in many cases we know what the problems are we need to solve. It's just how do we actually confront them. I want to talk about one of the things I see a lot of the best teams do is that they work really deliberately. And then finally, how should you thinking about changing, like actually affecting change? So let's start with traps. And I think a lot of traps for me are what is really going on inside of these companies? What are the real barriers that are there, right? Like, it's not a process. It's not that somebody didn't fill something out or they didn't check something off in Jira or didn't put something in Slack, right? Like, that's not what the actual problem is. In many cases, it is, and again, I said this is amazing. Like, no matter where you go in the world, isn't it strange how clients are all described the same? The barriers are all the same. No matter what culture you are going to, no matter what language you speak, people are people. And as I start to step back and take a look at this, what you'll start to find is the reason why that happens is something called cognitive bias. Now, I know there's a lot of people who right now want to talk about like design imposter syndrome and a lot of stuff like that, right? That's how do we show up and be more secure about that. That's great in dealing with us. The problem is how do we deal with everyone else and how they are showing up. Now, whenever you go through this, like cognitive bias is just really that there are hardwired reasons in all of us that can be deficiencies or limitations in our thinking that are really about why do we sort of have an allergy to innovation, to new thinking, to doing these sort of things. And a lot of that just really is, it's a hardwired thing for us. Now, as you start to study it, again, it depends on who you talk to and who you want to look at this. There are generally about 12 accepted types of cognitive bias. I've only got 45 minutes, so we will not be going through all of them. But I think that there are 3 that you will, and trust me, whenever I go through this, you will think of people, you will think of projects. You're going to think of things as I talk about each one of these. You're like, ooh, that happened this morning. But there are these 12 types of cognitive bias, and I'm happy to send out, I'll tweet the link to the article about this later if everybody wants it, judging by the number of phones that just went up. It's always a great way to tell. It's like, ooh, good slide, keep it. But there are 3 types of these that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about confirmation bias, observational selection bias, and projection bias. And as you can tell, a clinician clearly named these, because if it was up to somebody at a company, these would all be acronyms. But confirmation bias, it's okay, therapy. We trust the circle of trust, Fokker, it's good. Confirmation bias, right? Like, this is a huge problem in creativity. Confirmation bias is that there's an unconscious act that we only want to surround ourselves with people who agree with our pre-existing view of the world. Look at anybody's social media feed, look at American politics, look at anything like this. It is that if there is anybody who irritates me in the slightest and does not align with my worldview, I don't want to hear from them. And again, I think this has sort of been a real elevation in this. But how this manifests itself at work is that there's you, and if you look at the way a lot of people work, they surround themselves with people who tell them that they are brilliant, that they are amazing, that they're a genius, that they love what they do. They love that affirmation. And the reason why is because creativity is so inherently insecure. You give us a blank page, you give us a blank screen, you ask us to write a word, make a mark, write a line of code. What we put down is inherently personal. That's why if I gave a problem to everybody in this room, I would get back that number of solutions back. So, thinking that what we do is not personal is kidding yourself. But what we often don't tend to like is we don't like people who don't tell us that our baby is beautiful, right? They like, it's wonderful, it's perfect, you're brilliant. Like, the people who are like, it could be better, we're not big fans of theirs. But the problem is that so limits our thinking, because the best teams that I see and work with are the ones who challenge each other. They're the ones where if you show up with anything less than your A game, you're going to hear about it. And the ones who are even better than that actually actively hire for this. They look for people and they look for how do we build tensions into our team? How do we bring dissenting opinions to be able to do that? Because the tension between that becomes incredibly important to driving better work. But this is the thing, is that if all of a sudden you are surrounded by an entire team who all thinks the same, who all agree with each other, and everybody there is wired exactly the same way, then yes, the work will follow suit and be just as vanilla as a lot of those sort of things. So the ability to think through this becomes incredibly important. The other one is observational selection bias. Now this is something, and you'll probably think of product people, or maybe you'll think of like engineers, like you're going to think executives, somebody who does this, right? And this is whenever you notice something that maybe you didn't see before. Maybe it was an insight, maybe it was an observation, maybe it was a little bit of fact in your data or something. And once you see that, you find justification for that everywhere, right? Like this is why for a lot of heads of design, their role has now become executive hysteria management. It's just, like I said, therapy, it's okay. But no, that's the thing, right? Is because like all of a sudden some executive said something and then we're all running around like crazy trying to like figure out why they said that. Super simple example of this. If you've ever bought a car, right? As you go through and you buy that car, all of a sudden you're like, okay, maybe I want this particular make, or I like this model, or maybe I like that color. Well, isn't it then funny as you start to think about that, all of a sudden you see that car everywhere. I'm brilliant, I'm a genius, look at all these other people who have it, and look how, depending on who you are, there's all this color, or maybe there isn't that color at all. Like, yeah, no, go get a neon orange Scion, or like whatever you'd want. But like there's that sort of thing where it's like, oh, I'm so different, this is fantastic. But that's the thing, there's the same number of cars that have been on the road the entire time, you just didn't notice them. So again, our ability to talk ourselves into having good ideas is a really significant thing. And the last one is projection bias. And this one is sort of what it sounds like, is that we assume that pretty much everybody thinks the way that we do, even if there is no justification for it. As leaders, this becomes super simple at most companies, because what you'll watch is that you'll watch the design team, the tech team, the product team, the executive team, all these people assume that the other teams think the way that they do. Again, most of the teams where there's a lot of struggle here really happens in the white space between those boxes, because it's the assumption that kills you. And that what actually happens is that whenever you really back it out, it's this. It's an opinion versus an opinion versus an opinion about who's right. And like I said before, if this is what matters, are these sort of internal political battles about which team is right. Because what it matters at the end of the day is that none of you are right. Your consumer is the one that matters. This is why at a lot of companies I've been in the past, we would actually start to test things. Like once a week, we would bring people in because we had to recalibrate the source of truth to stop these ridiculous internal battles about which one of us was right. Because that wasn't what mattered. But then I think a lot of that also can go a little bit further, because as you start to, like I said, talk about those white spaces, especially for in-house teams, one of the really big rising problems that I see is something called feature blindness. And what that means is that as we go through and we're all sort of working on these individual features, individual pieces, individual journeys, we don't step back to look at the bigger picture. And that this can cause massive, massive problems, because it can be a lot of individual teams that make individually really good decisions. But whenever stitched together into a collective, they can turn into really, really bad experiences. I'll give you a very unexpected example. If any of you have ever played Pokemon Go, everyone who just smiled, it's okay. You don't, Carl raised his hand. Okay, that's why I see Carl's like, okay. Let's see, we're getting there. The room's we're starting to feel it. Pokemon Go, right? If you don't know what this is, Pokemon Go is this mobile game that would send you out into the world with your phone to basically go around through augmented reality to try to capture these little creatures, right? So people would start going all over the place. They're doing all this thing. It was this huge kind of trend. And like I said, there's still people who I travel with, speak with, stuff like that, still like we need to walk down the block whenever we go to dinner because there's some great Pokemon down the street that they have to go catch. I don't get it, but like whatever your thing is. Carl probably did that this morning. But here was the unintended side effect, right? Really popular game, made this company billions of dollars. But as you can look at this trend, like I said, of a lot of individually good features that line up to bad experiences. There were some very, very interesting side effects that have come with this game. The first of which is that there were a lot of people who were actually getting injured because there were people who were playing it while they were driving. I might argue that that was natural selection, that maybe those people shouldn't be around, but circle of trust. But that's the thing, right, is that there were people who actually were getting injured, they were falling off things, they were going into areas they shouldn't, and it got worse than that, actually. That there were people who were actually killed because they were trespassing on other people's properties, got shot dead because they were out there playing Pokemon. Like, that is just crazy to me. But then you start to see other things that started to happen with the data. That in many cases, the places where the Pokemon, so they reacted by that, by basically only putting Pokemon in white, affluent neighborhoods. And so whenever you looked at that, the racial and gender bias that came out of that was staggering that to be able to do that, because this is how they thought it was going to be fixed. But then there are other things like that that I think got so much worse, because again, individual decisions that added up to something bad was that they actually put a gas-releasing Pokemon in the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Right. So that's why I said a lot of individual decisions about we're probably going to look at population density, we're going to randomly pick a Pokemon, we're going to do these sort of things, and at no point did anybody step back to look at the big picture and say that in these certain areas, no, playing a game inside of the National Holocaust Museum, one, is probably wildly inappropriate, let alone two, having a poison gas releasing one in there is probably about the worst thing you could possibly do. But that's the thing, is like I guarantee you, these were a lot of individual decisions that everyone thought they were making the right decision or doing the right thing, but since nobody took a step back to look at what the bigger experience was and how it came together, that's such a huge problem. And again, I see this time after time after time in so many companies, usually not to this extent, but that's the thing, right? Is that then you end up with this, where you actually end up with these news articles and people who have to experience this. And it's unbelievable. But that's the problem, right? Is because what happens is between all of those are these cultural pink elephants, right? These things that we see every day and we just accept. I see it at time after time at all these different companies, right? So I think I'm going to take a second just to talk about those sort of pink elephants, because this is the thing, is that most of the problems we need to solve we know about. It's just, in many cases, these are the cultural barriers that we all know are there, everybody agrees with it, right? Like it's a stack of pink elephants and we know that they're there, just everybody sort of feeds them peanuts, as opposed to actually saying this is something we need to work on. And a lot of it for me is to use culture to be able to fight these sort of things. Like one of the things that I'll see at every single company has this, is this idea of like cultural apathy, right? And I'll give you an example of what this is. Every company I've worked with in the last year and a half has a phrase. And one of the companies I used to work with, it started with welcome to. And what would happen is you'd be sitting in a meeting and you'd be going through and trying to work through a problem. And at some point the problem would get hard, it would get difficult. We would try to work through something and we would say, hey look, we're not sure that there's a way to be able to do this, or we're going to need to change something that's difficult. And at some point somebody would put their hands and sort of shrug their shoulders and say, hey, welcome to working here. Like somehow if you said that, it was like this get out of jail free card to be mediocre and apathetic, right? I mean, like one of the things I used to do is I used to carry around a jar. And if you said welcome to in our company name, you owed me 20 bucks. I used the money to buy beer for the team, so it wasn't just for me. But it was that idea that I was not going to allow this cultural apathy that sat right in front of us every single day to keep going. Because it's ridiculous that like you could say this and then it just meant that like after that, be as mediocre as you want to be. Because then it was culturally okay. But this sort of like accepted cultural apathy, and I guarantee you every company I've worked with, because whenever I say that, people laugh and they're like, our version is this. Every single company has this. I think a lot of this also comes out of, like we talked about before, the fear of failure. Now, part of this also comes out of, I have a war right now about two words in particular. Failure is one of them, light bulbs are the other. Like for me, light bulbs are bullshit. Like if you use light bulbs in any of your presentations as of tomorrow, stop. Because the problem is that we need to think about the words that we use. We need to think about the imagery that we use. This idea that like creativity is this moment where like there's a light bulb that shows up over your head and all of a sudden like the clouds part and it rains champagne and puppies and like everything's solved in that moment is bullshit. But the problem is that it teaches executives and everybody else that what we do is easy. And it's not, right? Like creativity is a blue-collar profession. Failure is the same thing for me, right? It is not failure, it's learning, right? Failure is badly positioned learning. Right? Like I hate that when people are like, fail fast. I'm like, no. Right? Like that was the other one, my favorite one, like, you know, that poster that everybody has from Facebook, like move fast and break things. What they don't see is that a week later, that poster got covered up with another one that said, slow down and fix your shit. But that's the thing, right? Is like, failure is a finite state. Failure is getting it wrong. Learning is we did something that didn't work, and it's only a failure if we don't learn from it. It's only a failure if we don't share it, and that culturally we have to get over this. One of the things that I've done in the past that worked really well for this is I used to do this thing called the Bellyflop of the week. And in my meeting, what I would do is I would go out and I would buy a bottle of champagne, and I would give it to the person who would stand up in front of a room, probably bigger than this, and admit that they screwed up the biggest and what they learned from it. Because I had to make it culturally okay for us to admit that we didn't get it right. That again, it was only failure if we kept it to ourselves, if we hid it, if we didn't come back and be able to say, because I had to create a culture, again, of learning, not a culture of being right. Because that is, again, an inherent problem. For most big corporations, what happens is at the end of the year, you've got your big five, which means the we work that we do has to turn into what did I do. And so that you get a lot of individual I statements. And again, for me, it became very, very important to go through and to defang this culturally. And again, people didn't realize that. But whenever you have people showing up every week to compete and are even excited to share how they screwed up for a cheap bottle of champagne, sort of feels like maybe there's something there. But I think a lot of it is also then, how do you actually care for the mentality of how people show up every day, right? We build processes, we build methodologies, we build design systems, we build all of these structures to dictate why we do things. But the problem is that, the thing that I find is that almost no teams will actually build structures that try to define the mentality of how we show up, right? What is the attitude? Because if you don't have this, what happens is whenever the team isn't acting the way that you want it to, whenever people aren't thinking in the way that you want to, you basically have two options. One, you just sort of accept, again, the cultural apathy of this, people aren't sort of showing up the way that I want to, or two, you get to show up and be the asshole, who's like, guys, come on, like we can't do that, right? Like you're like everybody's parent. Neither one of those are great outcomes. But in many cases, what I've seen, there is no social contract, there is no agreed upon behavior that allows the team to hold each other accountable to how do we show up and what is our mentality. And I guarantee you, whenever you write these behaviors down, none of them are going to be rocket science. What seems to be rocket science is the ability to actually stick them on a wall, put them on a piece of paper, and hold people accountable to them. That does seem to be something that is very different. I'll give you a few, two examples of this. One is something like, again, if you are having projection bias issues, have a behavior that says, look, we put the customer at the center of everything we do. They are our source of truth. So if engineering, product, design, somebody walks in and says, I think this is what we're going to do, if they show up with that solution to be vetted, not a problem to be solved, you have the ability to say, hey, look, remember, we said that we're putting the customers that we're going to do this. Yes, that may be a great idea, but let's go validate it before we just blindly take it. Like I see this so many times where people just take requirements for a project like they're written on 2 stone tablets that came down from a mountain. And we're just like, yes, we will go do that. Well, should we? Who the hell knows? When we launch it, I worked with a company not too long ago. At the end of it, they asked me, they're like, Steve, what's our superpower? And I'm like, you've read too many damn books. But they're like, no, what's our superpower? And this is the problem, is that for their superpower, and the problem for a lot of other companies is their superpower was rationalizing mediocrity, right? They went through and they did a lot of stuff that really wasn't that great, and it was just a slight improvement of what their BAU work was, but man, were they good about convincing everybody else how just dynamic and amazing it was. This is why for a lot of companies, you'll see they'll benchmark themselves against other experiences in that same industry. If you are a bank, no one goes and opens and deposits a check in your app and then goes to another bank and deposits a check in their app and goes, wow, yours was better, right? We like to do that because that's a much easier comparison than thinking, no, our real competitors are Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Apple Mail, Amazon, whatever those are. That's a much more uncomfortable conversation because now we realize how big the gap is. And that's a huge, huge problem to be able to do that because, again, we're really good at rationalizing this stuff. I think you also things like invite diverse perspectives to the table. This is around collaboration issues. Again, bring legal to the table, bring your regulators to the table, because what you need to do in moments like this is, again, realizing that creativity and innovation is about how do I go through and get things wrong? How do I learn on the way to figuring something out? But that's the problem, is that for so many of these things, people don't actually do this. You can use this psychological trend that people will support what they're a part of. If you bring them in and say, hey, look, I want you to be a part of this, it's amazing whenever you get down the road how they're going to be an advocate for it. But the other thing that it does, and again, is that we talk about, the sort of white space between those. At most companies, what I see is they go through and they do these projects and something isn't perfect. Congratulations, that's called creativity. But what happens is instead of investing in coming together, investing in that team coming together and saying, look, we're going to work through this, instead what everybody invests in is a whole lot of emails figuring out which team was to blame. And then it's just it's no wonder that dysfunctional relationship doesn't produce better work. Again, the work is the truth. So a lot of this for me is about how do you figure out ways of working deliberately? What are other places where you can put these sort of social contracts in place to, again, attack the thinking that is going on? Because that's the thing that I've seen, is the best leaders give their teams frameworks that are able to create repeatable success, where you feel empowered, you understand how you plug into the mission. Because again, for most companies, that's the thing, we have these big, broad mission statements, these big, broad missions, these big goals, things like that, and people go, that's great, I have no idea how I plug into that. Where do I fit into that? How do I contribute to this? And so I think that there are a few of these sort of things to be able to look at. One for me is actually creative process frameworks. Again, how are you deliberate? This sort of freedom in a framework for how you actually create. One of the things I'll ask a lot of people, how do you actually run a brainstorm? Because isn't it amazing for so many companies, you go into some and they're so great and they're so productive and we have so many ideas, and the other one you come out there and you're like, I want that 3 hours of my life back. Right? That was a complete waste of time, it didn't work at all. But again, the ability to be deliberate in these moments, because the best ones that I've ever run, there were 7 rules, and I'll be happy to share what these are, right? 7 rules for running any brainstorm. And what I would do is I would appoint one person as sort of like the proctor, the police, like somebody who's going to make sure that we follow these rules. But here again, there's a shared social contract so that we were sure whenever we did a brainstorm, we knew that it was going to be productive. So the first rule is like to defer judgment. Because most brainstorms that I've been around tend to be more about judgment than they are actually about ideation. Somebody says something and they're like, well, we tried that back in 1984 and we did it with this and that didn't really work. Or, Bob, so-and-so executive, he's not going to like that. Like, it's amazing how many people will sort of incite executive names. Like, there's always a reason why. And this is the thing, right? Like, hope takes more work. It's so easy to be cynical. Like, go on any social media channel. Being an asshole is way less energy. Just go and do something negative. Super simple, right? Like, trust me, I'm from New York. Living lab for that every single day. But that's the thing, right? Hope takes more work. But the ability to say, look, this is just about idea creation, not about idea judgment. So that we're going to be sure to be able to let those ideas happen. To actually encourage wild ideas. Because isn't it interesting whenever you watch so many different industries, how two companies that are in the exact same industry release essentially the same feature at the same time? Because what happened is they went for the obvious and the easy insight. They went for the thing that was sitting right in front of everybody else, and then they wonder why we put all this work in and we still can't find any competitive differentiation. Right? The ability to come up with the crazy ideas, the big ideas, like that's the thing. Whoever the innovator is you love, like history does not remember well-behaved people. It doesn't remember people who thought small. It's the big, audacious, the ability to try something, to take the big swing for the fence, knowing that it's going to be hard, but the ability to have that wild idea that often gets rewarded. Huge one for this, to actually build on the ideas of other people. Because again, if you watch most brainstorms, most people do not listen for the silence to say yes and. Right? Yes, I love that and here's what we're going to do. They say yes, but. Yes, but I think my idea is better. Yes, but I think you're wrong. Yes, but here's these other sort of things, right? We are not building and not contributing to this. So again, we're really just sort of defanging our team's ability to do something really interesting. So the idea of actually building on other people's ideas. Simple one comes up a lot. Stay on topic. Isn't it amazing how many times you go into a brainstorm, you're like, this is what we're going to work on, and you come out 2 hours later and you've got this amazing idea that does not begin to solve what our problem was. So the ability to actually make sure that we stay on topic. Number one, most broken rule. And this is the reason why you need a police officer or a proctor. One conversation at a time. I cannot build on ideas that I do not hear. It is amazing how many other people want to start these little side conversations. Like, make it like Thanksgiving. If there are people who like to talk to each other all the time, put down like place cards, move them around. Because that's the thing is, again, we are here to work together collaboratively. So one conversation at a time. Be visual. Doesn't mean you need to be Picasso, but it's amazing how just a simple sketch sometimes can help. Also, again, getting out of this idea that, design means that you have to be Picasso. Here's the thing that everyone seems to forget. Everybody's creative. Everybody is creative. Like whenever I work with Fisher Price, you walk into their play lab, you see kids. Everybody's a singer. Everybody's a painter. Everybody's a superhero. There was a time whenever we were all creative. The problem is society, our education, our jobs have basically told us that those weren't viable careers. We're all the kids that survived, right? We don't listen too terribly well. But that's the thing, is everyone is creative, so they can get back to that place and they can, again, just make it about being visual. And a lot of it also is to go for quantity. Again, as you study the psychology of creativity, the thing that you see is that whenever you're posed with a problem, something you need to solve, it creates this little tension in your brain. The first idea that you have that you feel like solves that problem, you get this little dopamine hit in your brain. It's the exact same thing happens while you unlock your phone 200 times a day. It's the same reason why you likes on social media. It becomes a chemical addiction. The problem with creativity is that what it means is that once you have that one idea, your brain basically goes, cool, we're done. So instead of having idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, you have like 1A, 1B, 1C, 1C2. Like you just sort of push it around a little. You don't have actually divergent lines of thinking. So again, to set that expectation and to work deliberately to say, look, we need to come up with distinctly different lines of ideation. A lot of it is also then, how do you actually care for, and can your people, like this, right? Like, can your team actually articulate to me, how did they actually develop as a leader? How do they develop as a creative? Can they actually tell me this? Not like, yeah, I think I need to go like learn a plugin, or like, I'm gonna go to take a class at General Assembly, or this is what I think, right? Like, actually know where they are. Because one of the things that I'll do that works really well, and it can be incredibly painful for some teams, is I'll go in with a leadership framework. And I'm going to sit down and I'm going to ask this one person to do a self-evaluation. So again, like most models, there's a 1 to 5 model. 1 means basically people follow you because they have to. 5 means you have a real impact. Take that self-evaluation and tell me, where do you think you are? So you think, okay, great, I'm a 3, cool. The other part of this that we're going to do then is we're going to have the rest of your team go through and do the same thing. Because as leaders and as individual people, we are always our biggest blind spot, right? It's the same thing. I've recorded my podcast for 3 years. Every time I hear my voice, whenever I watch this recording and hear myself, I think I've heard my voice in my head for every day as long as I've been alive. I can't sound like that big of a tool. I do. Still doesn't sound like me, right? But your leadership, your creativity, everything else follows in that same vein, that you are always, the way you think you are is not necessarily the way you are to the world. So the ability to sit down with a team and have somebody say, I think I'm a 3, and have the team say, look, we think you're a 1 or a 2, or maybe you're a 4, can be an incredibly important thing to see who are the people that maybe give themselves too much credit, who are the ones that don't give themselves enough, but then to also know that you have the support of everyone else with what it is that you are going through. Because leadership so often tends to be, and we tend to impose this on ourselves, this isolating journey. That we're doing this thing, nobody else gets us, nobody else does this sort of thing, like, we have to figure it out. But that's the problem with that. And so this is literally the framework that I use for this. It's a 5-tier model. Tier 1 is the lowest maturity, means that people follow you because they have to, right? You actually have a title and somebody says they're in charge of your career and you say, okay, fine, I will follow them because of that. Zero respect and influence tends to come out of that. The second tier means that people will actually follow you because they want to. This means that that leader has actually started to invest in the team. They've actually started to show that they care. They have done something where you're like, you know what? I think this person might actually be somebody that I should listen to. So that they will start to invest in you there. The third tier is that this is where people follow you because now that you've started to invest in the team, they see that you have some impact on the organization. So this is not, again, that cultural apathy of like, we're just going to talk to ourselves. This is the 16th person that has come in here and said that they're going to, design is now going to be empowered, and why the hell should I listen to this person? But that you actually will produce real results, and that actually creates something that people want to follow. The next one is that they will follow you because of what you have done for them. Which means that whenever you talk about getting them promoted, whenever you talk about the fact that you will actually do something to help them, you've invested in them, you understand their process, you understand what is going on with them, like you've actually gone out, had lunch, had a beer, done something so you know them as a person. You could probably tell me what their wives and kids' names are, right? Like there's an actual investment in your team, and there is zero shortcut for this. Then this is something where, again, you're starting to get into that. And then the highest maturity is people follow you because of who you are and what you represent. These are the people where you will watch, people will follow them from company to company. That whenever they're gone, they'll say, oh, this person is the new, whoever that person's name was. They'll talk about them even after they're gone, that they have built an organization and built a legacy that will survive them. That it isn't this sort of, again, honestly, sort of selfish thing of like, well, this is only going to succeed when I'm here. And so again, the ability to have that effect through generations of an organization, the ability to do that becomes really important. But to sit down and, like I said, to do this sort of a self-evaluation and then have a team do that evaluation, I did this last week with a company. Yeah, it can be uncomfortable, but it also can really show that like a lot of leaders don't even begin to talk to each other enough, because we went through that conversation, so many people are like, oh my God, I had no idea you were working on that. I had no idea you were struggling with that. I had no idea that this was going on. Or like, you know what, I went through that last year. I know that this isn't what you're good at. Let me help you with that. But the ability to, again, be deliberate and open with these conversations so it's not just sort of like, because if not, then it feels like we're just playing favorites. And that's a real issue for this. But I'll sort of leave you with kind of like 2 thoughts here, right? I think a lot of it is also creating change can be really hard. And I think a lot of people, maybe don't necessarily think about it the right way. The way that I'll often describe this, and maybe it sounds a little bit strange, like creating change for me is always like falling in love. As of tomorrow, I'll be with my wife and married for 19 years, which I know is sort of like doing a magic trick, and it proves how much that she loves me and the fact that I'm not going to land until midnight, and she's okay with me being here instead of being home on our anniversary. Hi, honey, love you. But here's the thing, right? I can't tell you the moment I fell in love with her. Can't tell you the moment that I knew that she was going to be the greatest thing that ever happened in my life, right? I can tell you it's a lot of little things that added up to what was one of the greatest things in my life. Leadership is the same way, right? Like we've all watched Rudy too many times or something, right? Like somehow there's this big moment and we make this big speech and it's like a Pixar movie, right? Like, and then everything was different. And that is not the way that it works. And you and your teams need to understand that the way that you show up every single day, in every single meeting, in everything that you do is what creates the change. That this is not easy, it is not simple, and that for me, like change really requires 4 things, and these are usually not the 4 things that people are going to list. The first one is that it does require some amount of courage, right? You need to stand up and say the way things have been is not the way they should be. That I will stand up and I will take a position. Because at most companies, what do most leaders do? You float around with the status quo, because it's just easier. I believe what everybody else believes. Because the moment that I say, this is what I believe things are going to be different, I've taken a position. Which means people can judge me, they can laugh at me, they can support me, they can shoot at me, they can do all these different things, right? But that's the thing, is that at that point, the courage to say, this is what we are doing, and I mean it. Because that's the other thing, is that is the leader you want to follow. The leader who's just like, yeah, we're going to go with whatever everybody else tells us. Not super psyched to go into battle with that person. But the ability to actually have courage makes a huge, huge difference. For me, vulnerability, this is the new leadership currency, right? This is the new thing that, again, because we are at a time and a place where creatives have this opportunity. But it is a time whenever people, like, this is where social media is literally killing us. Like, here's the thing that I would love. I would love if everybody went for Halloween as who they pretend to be on social media. Because this isn't amazing. We're all tall, we're all good looking. We all have like shots of us like looking into a sunset with like a bald eagle on our shoulder, talking about how wonderful our team is, right? This is where we started this talk, right? The ability to, and I'm not gonna name who it is, but like I loved it so much when I was talking to somebody last night and I said, how's your job going? And he said, honestly, I fucking hate it. Yes! I know, Carl, you're just a magazine rack of issues. But that's the thing, right, is the ability to show up honestly, the ability to be vulnerable about what you are going through. Because as a leader, the thing that I have found is that for me, the most powerful things are for me to be vulnerable about who I am. The direction of the team and where we are going, that is much more absolute, that's much less in question because people need confidence out of that. But the ability to show up as a human, the ability to, I mean, again, it was staggering to me where I did an interview on Debbie Millman's podcast not too long ago. And at one point, she was like, oh, at one point you left this company. And I corrected her. I said, no, I got laid off. And she was sort of shocked and everybody was like, wait, what do you mean? Like, you're going to admit to that? It's like, why the hell not? Like, I'm so sick and tired of everybody packaging this thing up. Like, you know, this is all just somehow this perfect little thing and we're selling this story to the world. Like, the ability, like I said, vulnerability for me is the new leadership currency. These are the people that we want to work for. These are the people that we will stay with. These are the people, especially like I said, creativity is an inherently insecure state. So our ability to think about that becomes incredibly important. But all of that then means that there is some level of risk. You are going to put yourself out there. You are going to need to know that not everybody is going to love you. This is where leadership can be isolating. It can be a lot of those things. And that's why support systems like this become so important. Because the ability to say, no, you are not alone, that yes, you are going through something, that yes, you know, these are the sort of things that I'm willing to risk this, but damn it, it matters. Because I think that's the thing, is like creativity is so inherently personal that that's why this is important. And that's what it comes down to, right? Is also some level of emotional exposure. This sort of thing that like we're all great at, it's all wonderful and everything's fine all the time. I mean, again, that's what I'm saying. Like, don't have a full-blown meltdown on social media, but at least be honest about what you're going through. Because the thing that I've found for me is that there are things that I've admitted on my podcast, online, other things like that, that I thought would end my career, ostracize me. It's amazing whenever you do it. Tenfold, you will get back people who go, oh my God, I'm going through the same thing. But these 4 things become so incredibly important. But here's what I'll leave you with. Because I always think it's sort of like, I love like TED, right? Like TED Talks at the end, they sort of come together and it's like, we've got all these amazing people, all these smart people. Here's the ask of this, right? And here's my ask, is that, you know, with the challenges that we are up against, we need that crazy, we need people who are going to step up. We need people who will raise their voice internally and externally more than ever. Because it is so important, because what I'll tell you is that whenever you do it, yes, people are going to tell you that you are different. They are going to say that I don't understand this, that maybe I don't support it, maybe I don't like it. But the funny thing is, as soon as you find any success, isn't it amazing how those same people will seek you out for that exact same reason? And that's the thing, is like our companies need this. We need people who are going to stand up and be able to take this fight, to be able to do this sort of thing, to say this matters, and I'm going to be the one that actually kind of shows them the way. But the other part of it for me, why I think that I would ask and plead, and this is not something I will say in many settings, I don't say it publicly very often, but for the people that are in this room, the world needs our voices way more than you would probably ever imagine. Because about 2 or 3 months ago, I met this young woman. She's from Slovenia. She came and found me at an event. And she came up to me, and whenever she saw me, she started crying. Usually not the reaction you're looking for in a young woman who wants to come meet you. But the thing that she told me, and the thing that is astounding to me is that I'm meeting people like her at a clip of about 1 to 2 months, is that she told me that last year she tried to kill herself. Because by being creative, she was so ostracized at her school, she was so bullied, she so felt like whenever she went on social media and all these other places, that everything was always so great and so perfect that she just couldn't do it anymore. And that, you know, because she found people, and that she found like me and other people like that, who would stand up and say what was actually going on, that it was okay to be different, right? Because that's the problem for so many kids today, is that whenever you are creative, your story is not like anybody else. It's probably the insecurity in all of us. It's damn sure the insecurity in me. Where I went to school, how I grew up, what my experience has been, is never like anybody else. And because of that, society has taught us that that's a weakness. And it is a weakness that is killing people out there. It is literally getting to this point, and that's my ask of all of us, right? Wherever you can, however you can, to try to raise your voice, to share what is going on, to support each other, to do these things. This is why, for me, it's like, honestly, in my experience, 70% of leaders are in therapy. We are not doing okay. We need to be able to get together and to be able to support this stuff, because this stuff, you know, these people really matter. And that's why, for me, the thing that I'm going to leave you with, which has been my sort of battle cry to everybody else on these sort of things, for me has been this: to exist loudly in your company, in your life, to share what it is that you're going through, to share what that experience is, to put that out there to help other people. And because the funny thing you're going to find out is whenever you do that, it's amazing how much you help yourself along the way too. And I think that's a big part of it for me at Envision. This is why we do so much of what we do. Right? Whenever you look at things like Design Better, the blog, Design Genome Project, the Design Leadership Camp that we do with Carl, we're trying to help do this, right? And I think that, again, the more that we can do these things, the more that we can engage, the more you can engage in your companies and things like that, the better it is. Like I said before, I've had this podcast for about 3 years. If you want to do that, feel free to do that. But more than anything, that's my email address. If you are going through something, if you are trying to struggle with something, send me an email. I will always write back. I'll always reach out. I think we're always here to try to help support that, right? Because I think that's the charge for all of us, is how do you take that experience, how do you sort of, you know, wrangle that insecurity and step up to be able to do that and exist loudly. Thank you.